He wrote it all down. Every name, every place, every year. He was not seeking leniency, and he was not caught confessing. He initiated it, because he wanted the record to exist. Karl Panzram confessed to 21 murders, to sodomizing more than 1,000 men and boys, to arsons and train robberies and burglaries across 4 continents. The question the record leaves open is not whether he did it. It is what exactly built him. Karl Panzram was born on June 28, 1891, on a small farm in Warren, Minnesota. His father left before he was old enough to remember him. His mother and 6 siblings worked the land and fell behind on it constantly. He was 8 years old the first time he was arrested for public drunkenness. At 11, he broke into a neighbor's house and stole some food and a few small items. A judge sent him to the Minnesota State Training School in Red Wing. He arrived, by his own account, a boy who stole things when hungry. He left something else. He spent the next several years riding freight trains across the Midwest. At 14, he was arrested again, this time in Duluth, and held in the county jail for 30 days before being released without transfer to another institution. The record from that stay describes him as combative from the first night. In 1907, at 16, he enlisted in the U.S. Army under a false name. He was court-martialed for insubordination within months and sentenced to 3 years of hard labor at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Inside Leavenworth, he was subjected to a punishment then still in use, the water cure, forced restraint with water forced into airways. He recorded in his memoir that he entered Leavenworth already bitter. He exited it in 1910 with something that had moved past bitterness into a fixed, deliberate hatred, not of individuals, but of the entire species. Between 1910 and the early 1920s, Panzram moved continuously. The Pacific Northwest, Montana, New York, Scotland, Portugal, West Africa. He worked as a sailor, a laborer, a handyman. He also burglarized houses up and down the East Coast, stole a boat in New Haven, and sailed it to Newfoundland before running aground, and, by his account, robbed the home of former President William Howard Taft in New Haven, Connecticut, walking away with jewelry, bonds, and 3 pistols. With one of those pistols, he shot and killed a man in Portland. His method in the years that followed had a grim consistency. He would offer work to young men near docks and rail yards, take them to a rented boat or a remote location, assault and kill them, and dispose of the bodies. In New York, he lured several young men onto a boat on the Harlem River under the pretense of paid work. He killed 10 of them and sank their bodies in the river. In West Africa, specifically along the Angola coast, he hired 6 local men as porters, took them into the bush, and killed them. He described all of it with perfect calm. No remorse, no justification offered, no attempt to explain why one victim over another. He stated what he did, where, and approximately when. Henry Lesser was 26 years old and had been a guard at Oregon State Penitentiary for less than a year when Karl Panzram arrived there in 1928. Most guards avoided Panzram when possible. He was volatile, had already killed a prison foreman, and made no effort to disguise his contempt for authority of any kind. Lesser gave him $1, not as a bribe, not as a transaction. He gave it because Panzram was cold and had no way to buy cigarettes. Panzram was so caught off guard by the act that he did something he apparently had not done in years. He thanked someone. A correspondence began. In the winter of 1928, Lesser began smuggling in pencils, a few at a time, tucked beneath his jacket, and collecting the filled pages on his rounds before another guard could find them. He kept them in a locked box at his rooming house on Commercial Street in Salem. Each delivery of pencils went in. Each batch of pages came out within a day or two. Panzram wrote in whatever light reached his cell after the corridor lamps were turned low for the night. By spring of 1929, the manuscript ran to roughly 40,000 words. It was not a legal statement. It was not addressed to authorities. It was, in its own way, addressed to the future. Lesser read it through in one sitting. Then he read it again. Then he wrote to a publisher for the first time, a letter he described years later as the hardest thing he had ever put on paper, because he could not explain why the man who wrote those pages was also the man who had thanked him for $1. Publishers declined it for decades. Too explicit, too disturbing, too litigiously uncertain. The manuscript sat in that locked box, and then in a filing cabinet, and then in a banker's box on a shelf in Lesser's apartment in Los Angeles for 30 years. It was finally published in 1970 under the title Killer, a Journal of Murder. In 1929, while serving time at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, Panzram killed a civilian prison laundry supervisor named Robert Warnke. He beat Warnke to death with an iron bar. He did not attempt to flee. He did not deny it. He stood and waited for guards to arrive. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death by hanging. The Society for the Abolition of Capital Punishment wrote to Panzram asking if they could file an appeal on his behalf. His response, which survives in the record, was unambiguous. No appeal was filed. On the morning of September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram was walked to the gallows at Leavenworth. The executioner asked if he had any final words. The trap opened at 6:03 in the morning. He was 38 years old. The question that courts and criminologists have returned to ever since is the one Panzram himself posed and answered in the same breath. How much of it was true? 21 murders. That was his claim. The documented victims, those confirmed by independent evidence, number far fewer. 3 explanations have been offered, and none of them closes the case. The first is simple inflation, that Panzram exaggerated the count to ensure his record would be taken seriously, or because the act of overstating it was itself a form of control. Against this is the fact that he provided specific locations, methods, and approximate dates, detail that would have been unnecessary and risky if the purpose were merely to impress. The second is that killings committed in remote locations, on open water, in the Angolan bush, on desolate stretches of Western Rail Line, were simply never investigated. No body, no report, no file. Against this, the absence of investigation does not constitute corroboration, and Panzram had documented reasons to claim foreign kills that could never be checked. What is established? The scope of his movements, documented through arrest records, ship manifests, and prison transfer papers, confirms that he was where he said he was across the years he described. And at least 3 killings carry independent corroboration: an oil field worker in Montana, Robert Warnke, at Leavenworth, and a victim in Salem, Oregon, whose name appears in the institutional record, but which has not been independently verified at the level required to state here. Whether that presence proves the remainder, no court ever determined. Henry Lesser believed him. But what troubled Lesser, and what has troubled every serious examination of the case since, was not the body count. It was the question of Red Wing. What Panzram described inside that school, in detail in the manuscript, was not unusual for the period. The older boys assaulted the younger ones. Staff administered the leather strap for infractions and for things that were not infractions. A documented reformatory inspection from the early 1900s found conditions consistent with his account, noting overcrowding and unsupervised dormitory hours as specific concerns. He was not the only boy to pass through Red Wing. He was not the only one subjected to what happened there. What the record cannot answer, and what Lesser could not answer, and what no retrospective account can answer, is why the same institution produced one outcome in him and other outcomes in others. The manuscript did not plead for understanding. It did not ask for sympathy. It asked only to be read. He wanted to be a fact on record, exact, legible, impossible to dismiss. And he is. The case of Carl Panzram has never required a verdict beyond the one handed down in 1930. What it has required, and still requires, is a reckoning with what the record actually says. That a child was processed through a system designed to correct him and emerged from it with a map of every cruelty that had been applied to him, which he then applied systematically and deliberately to others. The 21 he claimed, the 3 confirmed, the manuscript still in print. He asked them to hurry up. If a story like this is why you're here, hit subscribe. We open a new file every few days. Every file in the vault has a story. We'll see you at the next one.